Hi, I'm Mayoto Ataraxia, and you're listening to Asian Provocation. Today, I have for you a conversation with artist Ekene Emeka-Maduka. Born in Nigeria, 1996, browsing a collection of sold artworks ranging from 2017 to 2020, contains many self-portraits gazing right back at you. She continues some of the thoughts and ideas of the likes of John Curran, the proportions, the posing, the relational aspects of character, the women. Then there's Karinda Wiley and his naturalistic paintings of African Americans, or referencing the old master paintings, the patterns, the colors, and of course Toyin Oji Odutola, another contemporary who investigates the socio-economic inequality, the legacy of colonialism, migration, dislocation, while simultaneously the recognition and understanding of the language of fashion, such as the artist Chloe Wise. We found each other as one does in 2021 on Instagram. We started a dialogue. I start to gaze back at her works as she gazes at me, the way she curiously gazes at the world, just like in the paintings. The immediate thing I wanted to know was what was her relation and interest with fashion, as she also started with fashion illustrations prior to her engagement in the current large format portraits. I wanted to know if we had similar observations and relationships to fashion, the way we navigate ourselves around fashion in our own works.
In the beginning, I was always sort of drawn to fashion. Maybe little things led me to that place where I never quite had a reason for it. I was just always so interested in the structure of clothing and like how that could be an art form and like a form of expression outside of just something that you wear. So I found that a really interesting, almost like a whole other language of its own. Also at the same time, the more that I started to do more fashion research, I was questioning if I still had that interest, if that makes sense. It just sort of died down in this anticlimactic sort of way, but the interest is still there. I think it's just that I didn't want to explore it as far as I thought I wanted to.
What fizzled your enthusiasm or changed your relationship with fashion?
You know, I used to be really fascinated with fashion photography, and I would also watch like the runway shows like every season, but it's kind of a complicated industry, I think. Like the face value is very fascinating, and I think that when you sort of delve into it, it's also maybe a bit problematic, not at all what I expected or what I imagined. Obviously, there were problematic parts of the fashion industry, like any industry, but it just sort of started to feel fake, just really complicated and also classist in a strange way. And, you know, just based on different settings, it's like, how much do you know and to fit into the circle and that very like elitist idea. And it's interesting because I find that now, and even within the art world generally, I find that the same pattern is also there. And I think that the fashion industry has really grown even in the last couple of years, but sometimes I question, has it really grown or is it growth that I imagine? I think that it's in progress, but not fully there. You know, a lot of brands are starting to think about representation and wanting to seem politically correct, not because they actually want to, but because that's what would help them remain sustainable.
So speaking about political correctness, what are your thoughts on issues like Black Lives Matter inspired affirmative actions and fashion trends? And what about your relationships with your buyers and the art market at large?
One really important thing that you said is how it's not a trend, but the way that the world functions, it seems to be very capitalist, and consumer culture is just we're so engulfed in it. It's sort of hard to decipher like what's actually real sentiments and when someone's putting up a show, but I feel like you could always sort of sense that, and then you could be wrong too. I love to be aware and observe people that I'm having conversations with. A lot of the times with a lot of buyers or people who show interest in my work, I talk with them and just kind of gauge what kind of people I'm interacting with, how they respond to the work, and just kind of seeing what their intentions are. It's also tricky because I think you can't always, someone could seem genuine if they want what they want, but I almost work around it like very intuitively, where I'm thinking consciously based on my interactions with people, even like curators. How are you approaching me? Does this seem well researched? Are you actually interested in? It's a great question, actually. It's something that I'm constantly dealing with.
Towards the end of 2020, the protest has broken in Nigeria, as thousands have taken to the streets against the federal SARS unit, a Nigerian security force, as well as against the police brutality killings, torturing, and extorting the people of Nigeria.
This is what we see in Nigeria. See what they are causing. See, they are releasing fire. They are releasing fire. Releasing fire. This is Lekki Toll Gate. This is Lekki Toll Gate.
Like many places around the world, the younger generations has been out on the streets, many for their first time, demonstrating, demanding immediate police reforms. But the protests has escalated, with the police forces firing live ammunitions into the crowd. Meanwhile, in Sweden, an art space called CF Hill in Stockholm was looking to prepare a new exhibition. A curator from the space reached out to Maduka to pitch the new show. The exhibition was to be called Stop, Listen. It would run from January 22nd to February 12th of 2021. The exhibition had the following introduction.
Diverse, dynamic, and as rich in nuances as its country is in people. The Nigerian art scene is flourishing, and it is with great pleasure CF Hill presents a meticulously curated exhibition with 18 of the most exciting Nigerian contemporary artists of the new generation, based in Nigeria or living in the USA or Europe as part of the Nigerian diaspora. In Stop, Listen, their work engages in dialogue with the observer in a vast array of expressions. While some create with strong ties to their ancestral roots, others choose to portray present-day events, reflecting both social, cultural, and political aspects of Africa's most populous country. Matte, saturated surfaces, or a glossy finish. A sublime blend of figurative motifs with abstract elements of hyperrealism with fine detailing, accentuating each pore of the selected subject's skin to perfection. One of the main benefits of art exhibitions where work originating from a specific geographical region is presented is the opportunity to highlight the varied visual expressions that creatives with the same national backgrounds may possess. CF Hill is a platform where artistic freedom is encouraged and freedom of speech is considered a basic human right. Therefore, we will allow each individual artist to throw light on the many complexities their work intend to touch upon. If one is to name a common thread in the included artist practices, it is their ability to create sensational art.
Towards the end of last year, they approached me and pitching this show. And so this curator reached out to me and was like, hey, we're putting up a show and it's about what's going on. And, he was really excited. He was like, I wish we could do it tomorrow. And I don't know, it just didn't feel real. The approach just felt very like, we're doing this because we want to have a show, and there's a certain popularity around buying Black art or supporting Black businesses, with the whole movement. And so it's kind of hard to decipher what's really real. And it creates this complicated feeling where we have been fighting for those opportunities and fighting for spaces and fighting for people to just see us as human beings and, the whole everything surrounding the cause. But at the same time, it also feels still devaluing. It's like, this is supposed to be the progression, but it's masked under this. It's almost like reduced to a trend.
In your works, you take back the power of the Western gaze, and in your own process, you gaze at yourself in your own practice with self-portraits. What's your experience around the idea of the gaze living in Canada today?
Honestly, I think it's very ongoing. I think it's something that's still very prevalent, and I live in a really smaller city in Canada. With Canada, it's kind of weird. It's maybe more intense in the States for sure. The whole atmosphere in the States, whenever I go to the States, I'm aware that I am in the States. And I don't know if it's more hurtful, I would say, in this way that it's very subtle and very hidden. It's not something that it's almost like you go back and you kind of think about, is that a weird encounter? am I being perceived a certain way? And so I think it's something that I'm still very conflicted about. And it's almost like a mental thing. The way that I'm working through it is sometimes I feel like, am I overthinking? Or should I be thinking about this? Is this, is this something that I'm thinking about? And then you don't really get any answers from that. Sometimes you do, but it's just sort of like this ongoing internal conflict. I think especially going to school here, because the experience, like obviously for me, living and growing up in Nigeria, everyone around me was Black predominantly. And so these were things that I didn't have to actively think about, but I can definitely tell that my interactions there are sometimes different from my interactions here, where sometimes I even sense like someone's being too careful while having a conversation, but it's just a conversation, it's like, but they're trying not to offend you. Or sometimes you encounter this too, like in art school. A lot of my work too references parts of my Nigerian culture and stuff like that. I think people are fascinated by what they don't know and what they haven't seen before. And so it's kind of like this tricky ground of like the fascination, but how is the fascination perceived? Is it being consumed? Like how is it being consumed? And you can sort of tell by the way that people would talk about it. You could have people who talk about it in a certain way and you feel comfortable with that. And then there are these encounters where it's like I had a professor actually who was like, yeah, why are you painting all these like regular stuff? You should paint more like Nigerian stuff, like, like the masks and like, it becomes sort of like a fetish. Like you can literally see your own like self and your culture being like fetishized in this way. Sometimes I think in Canada, it's kind of like hard to perceive those things. And so I think a lot of people are under this illusion that these things don't happen in Canada, which is very crazy because they do. I think it's just harder to perceive. And if you become aware of it, it's almost like you can't unsee it. And then you're constantly thinking too much or thinking not enough about certain things.
So if you're living in a very white community and you're not surrounded by people who are aware of these topics, how did you come to these awarenesses? Was it through certain books or people in your own family or in the community?
Yeah, it's very interesting how that sort of happened for me because especially coming from Nigeria where there's still a bit of the mentality of looking up to like your colonizer, even after all those years. There's a different approach and a different appreciation that for white people specifically coming into the country, it was very obvious in many things, but I didn't even have that awareness while I was living there. I read a lot and like I'm a very curious person. I would say I love to like look into things and I'm always questioning my surrounding and my environment. And so I think I'm able to perceive those instances, even though there were very subtle situations like that where you feel a bit conflicted. Like, is this a compliment? How should I take this? But I would read a lot of academic essays or do a lot of research, watch documentaries. I'm always gathering all sorts of random stuff. And I think that was an eye-opener for me, but also just, it's sort of like an instinctive thing. I could just sort of see the difference between the way that I would be like people would have conversations with. It's sort of like an observation thing where it's like maybe people are being like white people particularly being careful while speaking to me or speaking to me differently than the way that they would just have a conversation with someone else right next to me. So you can kind of see these instances. I think for me that was sort of, why is the conversation different? Why is it way,
It's the difference.
Yeah.
It's not the act itself that is so problematic. Mm-hmm. It's just through the observation. It makes you ask, why is it different when it comes to me? Why am I treated so differently to everybody else?
Yeah.
Is it their problem or is there something wrong with me?
Yeah, because that's where the otherness comes in, because then you feel othered, right? It's like, how come this conversation, like, why is it different? So you're constantly almost like questioning that, like, is there a problem? Like, what's wrong with it? To be able to sort of see this, to sort of get that awareness, you have to leave the country. You can't have it while being there. That's what I've realized. Growing up in Nigeria, it's the same thing. There's so much of the influence from being colonized. And it's very interesting. That's sort of like the reality living there. And then the moment you come out and then encounter a white person while you're living here, they're very fascinated by the fact that it's like we're so aware of their culture and so aware of them, even while being in our home years after colonization. And, you come outside and you interact with a person and they're almost surprised that you have certain knowledge about like stuff. They're like, oh, okay, like interesting. Like, I wouldn't have expected this, you know?
Yeah, it's horrible because I know how to be like them. The fact that I was born on a tropical island, yet I've been under this invisible branch of modern colonialism this whole time. And I've learned all about the Eurocentric values and their worldview. So much that even now that I live in Europe, I don't feel that it's foreign at all. But somehow, home, and this home comes with this heavy ambivalence because I'm still simultaneously othered. I'm still treated as the perpetual foreigner, still as an alien.
You must remember that when we came to this country, we were not traveling to a foreign country. I was taught when I was a young man that my country, Trinidad, was an extension of this one. We were weaned on the concept of the empire. When I was a young boy, I stood in 90 degrees of sun day after day and sang all kind of silly things like God Save the Queen, Land of Hope and Glory, Britannia Rule the Waves, with the greatest of fervor, and believed every word of it. To come here and discover that not only wasn't I not traveling to the capital of the whole thing, which we were led to believe was so, but in actual fact we weren't wanted, has been a very shattering blow. Many people in this country who think that we are very hateful are so wrong.
You see, this is the great mystery. When you came here, you say you found you weren't wanted. Why then did you stay? Why did you choose to stay here?
This was the heartland of the whole thing, and one hoped against hope that what one saw was not right.
That was a clip from Adam Curtis's newest film, Can't Get You Out of My Head, in an interview with Michael DeFreitas, speaking about his experience, a man coming from an ex-colonized territory, Trinidad, living now in Britain. This scene is followed by a heart-wrenching moment as a video collage where white men and women dancing were cut to a portrait of a black man looking at the whole scene. The camera zooms out to an audience of all white ladies, the melancholy of the way in which the othered looks into the mainstream society. What I find fascinating is that when your professor tells you, hey, why aren't you embracing more of your own culture, making work that is more from where you came from? You could be doing black art. You have the opportunity to get in on this. I find the whole statement really frustrating. Growing up in a society in which racism was the norm in Australia, in the way I internalized so much of that racism. But now the seasons have changed, and I hear from the same society that, hey, well, you're Asian.
Yeah.
Can't you be proud and do Asian things?
Mm-hmm.
And just as Michael DeFreitas in the film spoke about his past, coming from a colonized nation, I reflect on my own experiences and my own practice. For example, when I go and visit Asia and I film my own family, I realize that I have actually a more similar perspective of a white person. That it's difficult for me to not view the environment and not be a foreigner in the way that white people may orientalize the Asian environment without the foreign perspective, and to not orientalize the whole experience. I wonder if you have the same curious experience growing up in Nigeria, going to a Christian school, speaking English.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's really fucked up. It exists. And I think a great example of that too is in terms of like getting jobs and stuff. People who go to university there, and it's sort of harder, which makes no sense. I would never understand this concept, but there's sort of like this lack of appreciation for like our own culture that we're living with and that is ours, and sort of like this appreciation for anything that's foreign at all. So if you went to school in the States, all you need to do is come back and be like, yeah, I'm from the States, put on an accent. There's so much more access that you could go by. So there's definitely an even split. It's interesting. I find that a lot of people who are exploring that realm of rediscovering the culture, rediscovering their roots, I find that it's more prevalent with people who are in the diaspora and not, I mean, there might be a few people, obviously can't speak for everyone, but there might be a few people back home, but for sure and so you sort of see those frictions and like very visible cracks, which is just such a terrible thing. And I think it plays heavily into the society is super classist. And so you sort of see it with being associated with anything that's foreign. There's even very little appreciation for like local produced stuff, which is crazy. And then you sort of come outside and it's highly fetishized here. So it's like such a weird experience. And I don't think you can kind of see those things and how problematic they are while living in that reality. It's like when your reality is sort of happening and you're in a certain time frame, you can't really see the whole situation until you kind of step back. And then you're able to sort of get a full picture of how fucked up the whole thing is.
When you were in the United States or Canada or even in Nigeria, have you ever experienced people in the diaspora that one would describe as having a house slave mentality?
Oh, yeah. No, 100%. I find people like that most interesting. I feel like it's a way of denying your own existence and being, it's like they literally can't see what you can see. And so,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I have such a fascination for these people, yet I have to eject at a certain point.
Yeah.
How do you have conversations with these people?
Yeah, very similar. Yeah, and I think it really depends, right? Like, I have certain levels of like tolerance. Like, I'm the kind of person that would just sort of observe, like, be like, well, this is interesting. And like, it's so interesting to me too, how, you know, like you were saying in the beginning, you could very easily write the guy off as like all these different things, but there's also multiple layers to this person who I can look at very simple, like in such a simple way. I'm sometimes just like fascinated and leave it there. I'm just like, what an interesting encounter and what a random, like interesting person. Like we can't connect on any level. It's so weird to me that like I grew up in Nigeria, right? But that setup is still very like prevalent and you almost can't see it because I think it goes back to what I was trying to say about when you encounter someone and they're surprised how aware of the foreign land you are and they're like, oh, like you eat that too and you're aware of this and it's strange. It's almost like in a sense, that is sort of like the motherland because it's everything you've known and internalized since growing up. So it's like now unlearning that and now exploring who you are or yourself, whatever that is. You know, it's such a complicated feeling. And I think now too, like going back, it's almost in a way maybe distant, but not distant. It's so complicated.
So when it comes to dating and sexuality as a diasporic person living in Canada, what's your journey and experience like?
It's sort of interesting too, I think, like you were saying, outside of school experiences where it's very limited to your actual connection with the person and not really thinking too much about like so many other layers. Although I find that I'm kind of a very weird open person. Whenever people approach me or I'm approaching someone, I don't quite think of a lot of things. I just kind of interact with them and see like if there's some sort of common ground or connection at all. It really feels like almost like a very random, sporadic thing where it's like, I just talk to this person and we connect and I go from there. But I think that there's always sort of a common, like a similarity, of course, like similar experiences. And I find that maybe I find more comfort in people with a certain understanding of the different complexity that revolve around my experiences in a way where that might be like not really making intentional decisions. At the same time, like at the back of it, there's a lot of like intentionality and I'm more drawn to people who might understand me from a cultural point of view. And even though they might not be from Africa or like the same country or continent, I find that there's a lot of similarities across the board with different traditions and different cultural practices and stuff like that. And so at the end of the day, I'm always like still drawn to like people who might understand me.
And how do you unpack all the Christian and British relationship with sexuality?
I think that in its own is like its own thing. That is so complex. Like that time frame of being in school from 10, 11-ish, you're almost growing in those years. And I think it's a part of myself that I haven't even also yet been able to discard just because I graduated high school in 2014, like boarding school in 2014. And that's not that far away, right? So I think like there's so many complicated sentiments and complicated things that I've internalized that I've not even been able to face or question properly. And it's a complicated relationship too, because so my school was an all-girls school, and already with like in the society, like there's almost like this sort of no tolerance for homophobia. It's just It's very prevalent in the society. And it's interesting, I think, that in single sex schools, you reach a certain age, like while you're sort of like developing while you're throughout that whole experience. And there are these very intimate moments that happen while being in the school setting that have almost this underlying sexual connotation. But being in that sort of like Christian setup and adding the culture on top of it, I find that a lot of people conceal their own desires and ability to explore just because of all those different connotations. And I think that after those experiences, it's almost like a repressive like desires or just never addressing it. I think that's definitely part of one of those like complications and maybe even differences that I've met maybe in terms of moving out of the country. And there's a certain openness and exposure that everybody is experimental and you do what you want to do, like mentality here. And that is very not that prevalent there. And it's sort of like this push and pull situation.
How do you sexually relate to white people?
I honestly find it very complicated. I think a lot of the time I experience consciously like questioning what a white partner would see me as. And which I don't know, it's such a complicated feeling. It's almost like my own working through relearning my culture and relearning my history and understanding myself in that aspect is something that they might not understand. And I find like it could be frustrating in this sort of way. It's like you can never relate to me in completely. And so I find like there are some of these like frustrations that exist or it's so weird, right? I think you could really easily mask it as like, oh, preference. But I think behind that whole statement or idea of like preference, there are very intentional sentiments that actually go into whatever we call or mask as our preferences. I think that there might be more like complicated relationships between what we mask, what we could easily say call preference and the deeper or more complicated things that you're thinking of. Like it's like for a moment you kind of like be normal and interactions seem fine, but I think that there are small instances where I question like, am I being fetishized? Like, is this real? Like, I don't know. It's just very complex. And I feel like I haven't even been able to fully understand and maybe work my way through those thoughts or like fully addressing those feelings that I have, but I certainly do have them. And I feel like they've definitely like somehow always appeared in that way. And so, yeah.
What's your observation on the sexuality between Asian men versus Asian women?
With Asian women, I feel like they're very like sexualized. And it's interesting, right? Because I think there are a lot of these ideas looking at like Asian women in this sort of fetishized, I would say like you even see it in like popular culture with like anime. People build these ideas of fantasies and construct these ideas that they're perhaps more appealing, where I find with Asian men, and you kind of see it too in cinema, they never allowed like an Asian male to be seen as this sort of like desirable or like, you know, sexual masculine character. They're looked at in this way, like Asian men are sort of considered in popular media, maybe not represented as being able to portray like masculinity, the typical archetype for like what is a man, which I find really weird too, like, and question like where those ideas came from. And I think a lot of people consume, like non-Asians I'm speaking about specifically, they consume a lot of manga, like it's something that's becoming popular, even with Korean dramas. Just like even knowing some of my friends who are part of those communities, and I'm talking about females in particular, I find that now there's sort of this quality, especially for people that are in those groups, are really into like that genre. There's sort of like this new desire almost. I see it a lot with like K-pop fans in particular. There's sort of like this desire for the musicians, but I question, right? Like, is that desire as a result of how, you know, they've kind of like been portrayed and there's sort of like this glamour and like fascination about it that, so it's like, are you really attracted or is this constructed?
It's so frustrating the way that people are swayed into the power of the mass and groupthink. The way even in history ranging from, say, the Red Guards in China or the Nazi youth, you know, around the turn of the century, a little shoe brand called Converse and their Chuck Taylor All-Stars declared bankruptcy. And shortly after that, Nike came in and bought the company, poured a lot of advertising and product placement for the brand. And within a decade, they managed to convince the public that this was a countercultural brand and that if you wore the star emblem of these Chuck Taylors, you're an individual expressing your countercultural identity. There is now a fear, I think, that is sweeping us, that all our muscles of critical thinking and understanding are atrophied and taken over by market persuasion and consumption.
I think everything is just glossed over. There are no sentiments really attached to anything, and questioning things is sort of a thing that gets lost in that just constantly consuming all the information and just almost going through life. It's almost like without actually stopping for a moment to question and have some of these really complex conversations. Like, I think people don't have them enough, even outside of with someone else, but also with yourself in a way. It's like working through your own biases that you're unaware of and like what you've been sold into, but don't even realize that you're a part of. You know what I mean? It's just so, yeah, I find it terrifying. It's really crazy.
How has your self-perception and the perception of others changed over time in your process of creating large-scale self-portraits?
I think that's one thing that sort of made me aware in a way, without that maybe even being my intent in the beginning, or without realizing that that was something that was going to come with that process. One thing that remains important with painting myself is the ability to also become the viewer, to challenge my own biases and question myself and question the story that I'm telling. It's sort of a strange process. I think the first time that I ever painted myself, it was a really weird experience for me because I felt like I hadn't, it's like you're working on a portrait for hours and I hadn't really thought about the person that I am and thought about, who am I? Like kind of question that. I'm just like living in this shell and just kind of like going. It's interesting too because sometimes I become characters that I don't necessarily resonate with, but that I might have consumed information about. Like I made one painting where I was actually Donald Trump. And that was interesting, like just in terms of taking on these different like characters and exposing or concealing parts of yourself that you're aware of or unaware of. And yeah, I think for me, it over time morphed into these scenarios where I become the viewer as well. And I kind of challenge, in looking at the finished product, I challenge my own ideas and challenge my own self from the viewpoint of a viewer. And at the same time, thinking of myself as the subject as well. It's sort of like this dual feeling. It's like self-reflection. Like a lot of my work really, I think I try to piece out things that I've sort of internalized from whenever. It's like all this random information that you're constantly collecting. I think each time that I paint myself and reveal these sort of like internalized pieces of information, internalized like things that I've sort of like taken on both from, external factors, external experiences that continue to like change my perception or challenge my understanding of things. I think painting myself has created this moment to stop and think of myself outside of myself. And I kind of wonder too how that would evolve like over time and with different times and in different situations. You can only plan so much, I think, with art making, and when you're actually in the stage of like production, it's like totally different and a lot of unexpected things, a lot of things that you might have not considered sort of happen along the way.
Do you see yourself as a performer in your daily life?
I definitely think so. I think that there are certainly times that I question like that, like sort of like sense of performance is like based on a space that you find yourself in. Like it could be a mental space or even like a physical space. Performing to fit your surrounding is definitely something that I still see, but maybe I am now even more aware of just because I'm so conscious of myself, realizing that, but then continuing to perform.
What else can we do?
Yeah.
What's your relationship with control and power?
With anything at all, power is sort of a sentiment that we could be consumed by anything, I think. Because life is not very linear, it's sort of hard to maintain balance. I think of power as one of those things where you might say, yeah, I would never do this. But then you get into the situation and allow it to sort of consume you. I do think of power a lot as well. I don't think power is a bad thing. I think it's what you do with that power and what that power makes you, how you allow yourself to sort of exercise the power that you have. I think it's a very tricky line to easily cross, like with anything. And when I think of power too, I think of so many different structures of power, like even in a standpoint of being in my boarding school, there was kind of like this structure. We're always encountering like structures throughout our lives. Even the family system is sort of like its own structure, like that whole concept of like a nuclear family, an extended family. I think a society could be reduced to like this little spheres of like structures. I feel like I've always encountered power throughout my life in that sense, different structures and different positions of like being in power or not being empowered. So like an instance, like in boarding school, there's this hierarchy that exists. It's like You have like your seniors. And I think respect is something that is really like present in Nigerian culture. And like there's this whole idea of greet the elders. And when it comes to power and structures of power, they're very like prevalent just by virtue of being in the culture. And so growing up there, the idea is like you can't question a higher authority or you can't question an existing power structure. I find that that's maybe a bit different here, not entirely, but somewhat different. Maybe a lot loose, but not. It's like it's there in face value, but it's also not there. And so I always think of that sort of delicate balance that power sort of entails.
Isn't it interesting that in the current hegemonic societies, among those who have and enjoy the benefits of the power, would then make it very taboo and difficult for those who don't to discuss powers that keeps everybody in their position?
Yeah, it's kind of like with white supremacists. Like if you, oh, actually, this is so funny. There was this guy I worked with because I used to work at my university while I was still a student. And it was such an interesting office. For the first time, I've never worked anywhere like this. Literally everyone who worked there was considered a minority in society. But we were the majority of the office. And then you had 3 white people. So it was so interesting to see that subversion of reality. It was very trippy, I have to say. And it was obvious. And there was this one guy that started working there, this white guy, and he was so upset about it. It was very chill, typical like university. I think any work in a university, like student work, there's kind of like this chill laid backness to it just because like everyone's a student. But it was very interesting to see how upset that this guy was. And he wasn't even aware of his own fragility. So we would take turns to play different music. It's like, oh, you're playing music today. And he's like, he has to go through how many different cultures that he has in it, or like music that doesn't resonate with him. And he's so upset about it. And he kept like bubbling it up and didn't say anything. And one day he's like, I'm done with this shit. Like, it's like, you guys are always playing this music. I was like, But I found it something that was weird to me in that situation. So most of the people in the office were actually immigrants. And I find that we immigrants have more tolerance to these sort of situations. We don't get as upset. We kind of like endure them. And it was very interesting that this guy could make all these remarks, and he was like blatantly racist. Like he was openly racist. He didn't even hide it. He said some really horrible things. And it was interesting to me that these are things like we should have reacted to more than we did. But we kind of just, yeah, he's an idiot. And one day my boss was in, he made a really racist remark. Like the guy made a racist remark. And my boss was like, what? Like people can openly say this? He was so surprised. And our boss is a white guy. He was like, what? And we were like, yeah, this guy is weird. He's like, why didn't you guys say anything? It's like, how did you just, but I find that kind of showed me that there's so much more tolerance from a lot of immigrants. Like
I've experienced this so much in my life. It's so nuanced and so common, so fleeting.
Yeah.
And yet we're not able to discuss it because it's all just really mundane.
Mm-hmm.
And yet at the same time, it's really prevailing.
Yeah.
So we're not in this position of power. We have to endure it so much more. And what's interesting in this current so-called free society and this current political climate, the hegemonic white society is so accustomed to this fantasy and this myth that we're all equal, which just makes it so much more difficult to address these structures.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
There's actually so much disparity and unfairness amongst the different classes of people. And the more people believe that we're actually living in a fair and just society, the more difficult it is actually for people to see the structure, the more stubborn they actually become. And so if anyone outside of the hegemonic powers exercises their opinions or freedom of expression,
yeah,
the ones in power always say, well, hey, hold on, you've crossed the line.
It's kind of like the thing we're saying where it's like you can be yourself, but only to a certain extent. It's like there's this sort of idea of free and everyone's equal, but there are still these signifiers where in these very little instances you kind of see that structure where it's like, oh, you've crossed the line. You even sort of sense the change in reaction, the change in it's like that's going too far. It's like these visual like signifiers that I should back off now, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I remember when I was in high school and my family lived in a predominantly Taiwanese suburb, and I invited this white friend from school to come to my part of town to get some food. So I took him to this Asian strip mall where most people there were Asian. And he was this tall white guy, and I remember his panic. He said, "I've never seen so many Asians in my life." I mean, it was just a strip mall, but suddenly he was petrified. He told me how uncomfortable, how uneasy he felt. And so the funny thing is, historically, there's no reason for him to be scared. He never faced discrimination from an Asian. There's no history with his people facing violence from Asians. It's actually me that should be the one in fear every day, being in a white Australian society. Historically, the non-white people have experienced colonialism and violence. I mean, I should be the one petrified.
Yeah.
It's unbearable, this feeling, to endure white people's inability to understand this concept.
This story that you told also just reminded me of this an exact experience I've had. This is when I was in art school. There's a girl who moved from the States. And I think I can't remember what state she moved from. I think she moved from Ohio. She hadn't encountered a lot of like Black people or like even seen like Indians and like a lot of people. And so she moved to Canada, and which is decently diverse in a way. And she saw a lot of like, she was so afraid. And she told this story. It was so interesting. Like my friend and I were in the studio, and she's like, my mom and we were at the there's this like popular, it's kind of like a Walmart situation. It's called Superstore they have here. And she's like, we're at the Superstore, and I couldn't believe they had an international aisle. Like, and it was so interesting. Like, the fear. And I was like, wow, like, why would you, it's like, it was so interesting to encounter that. And I think I've never really thought so much about that one incident until you brought up this story. That's crazy. It also goes back to what we were saying about like enduring those situations. It's like, I think with endurance too, like you're sort of always building tolerance with each encounter to the point that you could just sort of brush it aside and deal with those like shitty sentiments like in the moment, and you just kind of go on and then encounter the same thing again.
It's so difficult. There's such a need for healing, but simultaneously there's a need to remember from history. But we don't learn a single thing. It's as if we go into every new flirtation and romance as if no one has ever fallen in and out of love before.
That's a great like metaphor for it. Yeah.
I realized in my interactions with Ekene that I actually knew very little of Nigeria. A quick wiki search tells me that its southern coast is on the Gulf of Guinea in the Atlantic Ocean. It is comprised of 36 states, Lagos being its most populous city, as well as the most populated city in the African continent, is one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world. And as of 2019, there's an estimated 206 million inhabitants in all of Nigeria. It's the third largest youth population after India and China. As part of the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885, a conference organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany, formalized to scramble for Africa, dividing up the regions of the continent. It was colonized by Britain from 1800 to 1960. And after World War II, Nigeria has its own constitution legislated by the British government. Nigeria is actually a multinational state inhabited by more than 250 ethnic groups, speaking 500 distinct languages. The official language, however, is English, quote, to facilitate linguistic unity at the national level, which makes me wonder about the power structures of the society. I wondered if Ekene spoke any of these other 500 languages.
No, this is very interesting too. I don't. I lived in the northern part of Nigeria, which is very fascinating for even a lot of Nigerians from where I'm originally from. You see, it's kind of, it's so fucked up. I think the idea is, the British came and there were all these different empires that were set up. Some of them weren't even in good terms with each other, or there were all these different complex relations and people that existed. And the British just sort of got the colonies that they had and lumped them all into one country, irrespective of, whatever those histories were, whatever those complications were. And so now in post-colonial Nigeria, you still see a lot of those divisions between tribes. There was a certain point where people from my tribe were threatening to leave the country. As a result of that, there are these constant, who's going to get to rule? Your people ruled. last year. And the funniest part of it is that in the country, there's no realization where these sort of conflicts are coming from. It just seems like something that's been ongoing. Like, but no one really thinks about the fact that it's also as a result of colonization and imperialism and everything that came with it. And so for a while, I think also that made my identity really complex in a way, because growing up in like a northern state, I felt northern like when I was a child. Like I really felt like that was my tribe because that's all I knew and that was my experience. But it was kind of unfortunate to sort of realize that, well, that's in fact not my tribe and I'm not necessarily accepted fully in this tribe that I imagined was always mine. And I think that was sort of a moment for me. But as a result of all of those different complications, everyone in Nigeria just predominantly speaks English. I think more and more with more generations, like the languages are being lost, which is really weird because that's happening within the country. And I find that, in fact, more people who are from the diaspora, like even, people who for generations have lived outside of the continent and have no awareness of where exactly they came from, there's this passion and wanting to find the roots and wanting to connect with those roots and wanting to learn the languages. Like there's so much more passion and maybe like fascination with that. Whereas back home, it's very different. There's definitely like a lot of cultures are sort of like losing their languages and losing their identity, but not even being aware of it. It's just sort of develops further, pushing more and more away from that. It's always kind of haunted me that I can't speak my language.
Yeah, it's such a loss with all these disappearing languages and ideas. With this in mind, then, what is your reaction to the word and the idea of integration?
My relationship to that is very complicated. I think especially now I'm like living here in Canada, I think it's the same thing with like colonization. There's this, okay, let's unify everything. You're being integrated into this one system and like learning this way of life, or kind of like moving to a place and like trying to assimilate to the existing culture and like functioning of the place. But at the same time, I feel like it's the same thing again, where there's a lot of loss happening. And then at the same time, after integrating into whatever place, you're not fully, it's almost like you don't fully relate to what you've integrated in. It's like, yeah, I'm in this new space, so I should kind of like assimilate or part of the culture and sort of like general setup. But then at the same time, I feel like there is a lot of identity that's kind of lost in the process of that. And then also just after the whole process of like integrating and feeling like, okay, well, I'm now part of or should be considered part of this sort of society, there's still a hierarchy or still like an otherness that still follows that, or like still is present. So it's like, yeah, I'm part of this society, but I'm not seen to be part of the society at the same time. And I've also lost my idea of like where I come from and like parts of myself in the process of this integration. It's kind of complicated in that sense. Do you experience this sort of disconnect sometimes when you interact with people still living in Taiwan and like still, when you go back, I would say my sort of experience, I actually haven't gone back home since I moved here, but there's kind of like this disconnect, even sometimes I experience when I'm talking to my friends who still live in Nigeria, where it's like now they see you as kind of not Nigerian enough, or so it's like you can't relate to them in that way, and at the same time you're not white enough to like where you've now integrated into. It's almost like an identity crisis, and it's just kind of ongoing, and it's such a sad, very, very sad feeling. I think at the end of the day, all those experiences, it was very interesting. Somebody asked me and my sister, we were both there, and they said, do you consider your past self you, or do you feel alienated from that past self? For me, I felt like, all those different layers and experiences somewhat are the different complex layers that they're like the different intersections that I sit in between and are, I think at the end, still part of whatever I am. It's like everything and then nothing. They're just times and different things that you've gone through or like gathered, and it's just like a bunch of experiences that have given rise to the person that you are and are still valid parts of who you are, I feel.
So between you and your sisters, do you share similar views and outlook on life, or are you distinctly different from one another?
I think we have a lot of similarities in that sense. And I think especially since moving here. So they moved to Canada before me. I was sort of always like with them, but separate from them in a way, because I'm the youngest. And the both of them are like closer in age than I am. So I felt like they had more similarities and kind of grew up together in a sense. And I was always growing up by myself in a weird way. But then now we also live together, and I feel like this is an actual experience of getting to know each other even more than we imagined. I feel like in family systems, there's sort of this, you don't choose your family members. I feel like family operates in this weird way. But I find like sometimes we look at our families as existing to fulfill a certain role. It's like, this is my sister. So it's like the sister fulfills a certain role. It's like, there's certain things I don't talk about with, it's like parents. It's like they fulfill a certain role and we see them in that way. I feel like a friend could know so much more that I've gone through than like a family member might know that I've even gone through. And I think that that system sort of allowed me, maybe growing up, to kind of forget that these individuals are complex individuals with so many layers and so many experiences and similarities. They could exist as like just another person in the world outside of that family unit. But I do feel like we're very similar and like we have similar interests. And I think one thing that maybe sort of makes that more apparent is the fact that we're all practicing in different ways, like art. My oldest sister is an architect, like she studied architecture and she does design. And our middle sister is an artist as well. So I feel like maybe in some ways those common ground sort of brought us together, and in a bigger sense, sharing those similarities and turned around what you would imagine to be like, oh, this is just my sibling, to something more of like a friendship in that sense. And I feel like that developed more while I was living here as opposed to like while we were younger. And I think now, and I wonder what crazy shit my parents must have been doing, but I don't know any of that, right? It's like, in my mind, they just fulfill the role of a parent. It's like some things that you would do in your life, but you can't tell your parents ever.
Yeah, it's very similar for me too.
Mm-hmm.
And what about your father? What's your relationship like with him?
Yeah, we were actually close. We're still close, but I feel like even in that closeness, there isn't like full transparency, I think, because of that idea of like, yeah, this is my father. And so it's sort of like the structure of like, yeah, you're close and like you talk about stuff, but maybe not all the stuff. But I would say we're close, yeah. I also think there's this sort of mentality, it's like very prevalent in different parts of Nigeria. It's like, and I think it goes back to what I was saying about those different like hierarchies that exist and like the level of like respect. And it's almost like in your mind, it's just like there is this divide of the different roles that you could even see those things happening within a family where it's like each person exists to fulfill a specific role. And we're not really able to see each other as individuals, but somehow we're close, but not so close. It's like this strange. I actually did a project on that because I was randomly interested in just like, who are these people really? Like, what have they done? I became more and more curious about them, and also questioning like my perception of them and my inability to see them as complex human beings without realizing it.
In which way did you approach that?
It's very interesting. I feel like my process is somewhat performative because I have to like take photos of myself. So for that project, I got a friend to take the photos for me, and I had to do whatever impression, like the very first impression that came to my mind each time I thought about each individual in my family. And I sort of like made a facial expression that I thought best attributed like each person. And then I painted them as myself. It was almost like I was performing my father, performing my mother, performing my sisters. In a way, it exposes this, it reduces a complex individual into this one expression and into this very limited depiction. It like erases all sort of information that you have and reduces them to what you perceive them as. And when I finished that project, I was curious to know what they thought and like which ones they thought they were. And I showed it to my mom first, and she was like, oh yeah, that's definitely your older sister. And it was interesting to me how those perceptions were like similar. And it's like, do we all perceive ourselves in this way? It's like each individual. I think about that project a lot, and I think about expanding on it just because I feel like there's so much more to address in that subject and to sort of like explore. And I think it exposes a lot of the biases that we're unaware of. And I think it goes back to sort of what I was saying in the beginning of me painting myself and becoming the viewer and becoming aware of my own biases and my own point of view of how I perceive things. And it's like, in one standpoint, while you're living within your own body and going through your own experiences, you're sort of like just going through it and not really aware of everything. But then being able to sort of like step out and even question the way that you're thinking, and it sort of creates this shift and subverts that lens of how you see yourself and you looking at yourself from a different point of view and seeing your own, like coming face to face with your own biases and your own, because all these things are sort of like internalized. And I think that there could be an unawareness in what we've internalized sometimes.
What are your thoughts on connection between Instagram, selfies, and narcissism?
I think it's very interesting too, especially in this era where there's sort of like an emphasis on self-love. It's very interesting and very tricky. I think this is an expression of self-love, or this is, it could be seen as something so trivial, but at the same time, I think that there's something narcissistic, like an underlying narcissism to those actions in a way. And it's like, well, it's okay. It's a thing. And, we just all sort of perform. I think selfies are really staged, and you only share the pictures that you want people to see and share the parts of yourself that you want people to see. I think it's also a sort of performance in a way. And so it's like depicting yourself in the way that you want people to see, concealing or revealing what you want people to see, and sort of controlling the impressions people have of you, or trying to construct the image of yourself that you feel most comfortable with, or at a specific time. Because sometimes it's like you look at your old selfies from God knows when and you cringe, like, oh my God, I can't believe I subscribed to this fashion trend, or to, it's like looking at pictures from 2008, like, what were we doing? But I think a part of it is very like narcissistic. And I think that too could be said for self-portraiture. Like there's a thin line that could be crossed.
We're really the children from the century of the self. It's such an intrinsic part of the global economy. When I was a teenager, I went through my own period of self-exploration and self-gazing with the act of self-portraits. I didn't grow up with social media during that time. I inherited a digital camera from my parents, and I started to take these self-portraits. I was able to look at myself and not share this with anyone. But what I saw was, there was this growing conflict inside of me. There's a quote from Richard Nixon that he confessed to his psychologist, that when he looked at himself into the mirror, he didn't see anybody there. I remember when I saw myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I saw this ugly other. I was horrified. I cringed. I remember when my friends went through my camera and saw me, I felt my universe imploding inside of me. I couldn't bear that others see this representation of myself, this act of me gazing at myself. It's taken me quite a long time to work through that self-acceptance.
I do have very similar sentiments, because in a way I'm more comfortable with even seeing myself in a painting, in the sense that it is a depiction of me, but in some ways it's still different from like an actual image of yourself. And I think about like the process of like even being able to look at images of yourself. Like I'm definitely not a person who's comfortable with, like, if I have to do a stream, I will do it. But at the same time, there's this sort of, I think I had to kind of become comfortable with my own image, which is very interesting. It's like feeling unfamiliar with yourself and then documenting yourself as a way of facing yourself almost. But I still have like such a complicated relationship with seeing my own image. In Nigeria, and like with a lot of African countries too, it's really big too in Jamaica. Like a lot of people would bleach their skins, and like there's this sort of, once you're white, the problem, like it's solved. Like how could you go wrong? It's like it's such a strange but very complicated. I see a lot of the time like people straight up just like, that's so fucked up, like we shouldn't be doing this. But I feel like it's a more of a complicated sentiment for those people to kind of work through. Like it's kind of like, oh, you know what, it's reminding me too of like, the movie we watched, what's it called, with his parents, the documentary style, and his actual parents acted in it, and like the actor
Quitting from 2001 by director Zhang Yang.
It's kind of this idea where it's like, but the drugs and like, well, why are you doing this? But for the person, it's like, yeah, you're like, just stop. But it's not an easy, it's not like automatic. It's not like, it's so much more of a complicated feeling and a complicated thing. People actually approach it.
Yeah, there's so much structure that we live under. We're such hierarchical creatures. We love playing this game. In Thailand, for example, people with darker skin are automatically placed in the lowest caste of society. It wasn't even about white supremacy or Eurocentrism, because Thailand still remains as the only country in Southeast Asia not colonized by Europeans.
Yeah.
But within their own system, they still see the lighter, northern, potentially Han Chinese people as superior. The last time I was in Myanmar, and with my Western gaze, I would see these workers in construction sites. They're working barefoot, topless under the sun, with incredible body and physique. And compared to the lighter-skinned aristocratic levels of society where people are desperately working out at the gym, these lowest castes of people look incredible. And in New York, they would be casted to be on a fashion magazine cover. But because of the structure and system, the person will unfortunately never get anywhere. And going back to the first discussion about fashion, I feel disgusted by the way fashion reminds me of the movie Hunger Games, where the controlling class would give out these lotteries. And there might be this hope that there might be a chosen one, just enough to maintain a class order.
Yeah, like I'll give you something. We're seeing that too now with like people trying to be inclusive, like more Black models. And it's like, yeah, we're giving you something, so you should be satisfied.
Really, no, this is not for play. I see you and you see me, you wanna ride the wave. I could spot you from a mile away. Tap the gas and I'm gone, this is not a race.
Ekene Emeka-Maduka is an artist whose work combines lived and formulated events relating to notions of displacement, self-representation, and reconstructing identity. She investigates the effects of cultural, social, and political exposure on developing individual identity and its relationship to communal experience. News footage from The Guardian from October 21, 2020, with footages from Lagos reporting on the Nigerian protests. Interview clip with Michael De Freitas is from an excerpt from Adam Curtis' BBC series Can't Get You Out of My Head from 2021. Asian Provocation is a queer conversational podcast sharing invisible ideas and stories with a focus on Asian diaspora. Links to the episode as well as other information can be accessed on asianprovocation.com. Asian Provocation is produced by yours truly, Bayoto Ataraxia. Music by Brandon Miller, MBHD Nick, Amber Spill, Cerulean Skies. Additional voicing by Liv Phoenix. This is an independent, listener-supported podcast. You can donate one time as well as a subscriber-supported on patreon.com under Asian Provocation. You can tweet me at AP_pod or connect on Instagram at Asian.provocation.
I see the money, whoa, pick and roll, give and go. I see the money, whoa, pick and roll, give and go. I see the money, whoa, pick and roll, give and go. I see the money, whoa, pick and roll, give and go.